Hello and welcome to another live stream with Just in Time World Building. I am here with Four Corners of the Page, who is a booktuber, and we are going to discuss the world building that readers actually appreciate by talking a lot about Malazan. Won't you just give us a little bit of an overview of sort of what your channel is and what you do and why?
Okay, so the first thing I should tell you is that I'm useless. Hello, I started in January, my channel. I'm still, I wouldn't call myself a baby at this stage, maybe toddler is a bit more apropos. But I really wanted to jump in on these conversations that are happening on BookTube. I don't really know that many people in my own life who love reading as much as I do. And so the ability to come into chats like this and just kind of have a good time with it has just been phenomenal. So my channel is a bit of a ragtag assortment of nothing. So I try and I interview authors, including Marie yourself. By the way, your books have now landed in Scotland on my doorstep, so I'm looking forward to getting to those. My mother was less happy with the massive package of 4 books that I landed, but she'll forgive me. I do kind of slight, I'd call them maybe slight analyses. So stuff like audiobooks. I try and give fresh perspective, magic in fantasy, things like that. And then also just that kind of general assortment of discussions and tier lists. I love a good tier list, things like that. As I say, pretty much an assortment. But yeah, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely. So before we get going, since you're Scottish, I have a question. How do you pronounce that?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. However you like is the question, is the answer. Bunahaven? Sounds right. Okay. I think if I said Bunahaven, people wouldn't call me out on it.
Then I'm not too far from the truth.
Have you met many Glaswegians? Because our accent is kind of notorious for being a bit impenetrable.
No, I have not met that many Scots. I just drink a fair amount of Scottish whiskey.
It's the best of our culture.
It is glorious.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about Malazan. And I'm just going to say hello to Lupix, who's one of my channel members. Hi, Lupix. Good to see you. Okay, so we're talking about Malazan. So why don't you take us through what about Malazan really impacted you in terms of the first kind of 10 books?
Okay, so my journey into Malazan was quite similar to a lot of other people, which is that I finished Dance with Dragons and had an itch to read some more fantasy. So I read Song of Ice and Fire as far as you can go. I then read The Dark Tower. I don't know if we've talked about Dark Tower, but that would be a separate conversation. And then I kind of went on a Google deep dive and literally looked up like what other series are comparable to Song of Ice and Fire. I would now say that Malazan isn't very comparable to Song of Ice and Fire, but that was one of the things that came up immediately. So I bought Gardens of the Moon. And I was also at this time, it was quite a formative time in my life. I was like 19, 20. And I was going on my first sort of big international travel trip. So I went to Australia with some mates. And I couldn't drive at that time. So I was sitting in the back seat, and a very sociable chap that I brought Gardens of the Moon with me. And so I basically spent a week in the back seat of this car reading Gardens of the Moon. And then, as soon as I finished it, I bought Dead House Gates, which is book 2, then Memories of Ice. And the whole thing took about a year to complete. And as I say, it was also a very important time in my life. So I think when you're kind of in that kind of late stage of university, you are kind of discovering who you are, as trite and cliche as it sounds. So I read this series over the course of that year. And it's the year I met my wife, and it's the year I moved abroad for the first time. So there's a number of things going on. It was also the year that I needed a lot of edges knocking off, I think, from a personal perspective. But I was also just fundamentally entranced by this work. I'd never really read anything like it. And I know that Malazan fans have a reputation for being a bit smug and saying, oh, well, it's the best series ever. And if you don't like it, you're the one who's wrong. And I would disagree with that vehemently. But I do think Malazan does some things, if not uniquely, very, very well. So I think one of the things that Malazan does extremely, extremely well is the way it handles plot structure. That it isn't just telling this one linear narrative the whole way through, that you have all these different stories that seem entirely distinct, but begin to braid together towards the end. And they don't just braid together sort of, come together in like an Avengers Endgame style big fight at the end. It's much more subtle than that. It's much more complex. It's much more thematic. And I think that was really interesting. I love how Malazan handles themes. It often upends the traditional way of looking at things. So, for example, Malazan is really known for compassion and it being a discussion on compassion. But actually, just saying we should be more compassionate is a fundamental misunderstanding of what Malazan, I think, is trying to say, because it really does crack open that theme and examine it from a number of angles, and doesn't always just say, listen, compassion is where you should be ending up here automatically. But one of the things, and I think this will go back and a really good thing to have a discussion on, is the world building in Malazan. I think is really something special. And I think a lot of that, and this isn't the only thing that is important for world building. In fact, for some series, it's incredibly minor. But a lot of people will talk about the scope in regards to Malazan, right? That it feels so big and it feels so vast. And actually, when I had a discussion with Stephen Erickson, last month, I asked this to him.
It was a great, for those of you who haven't seen it, it was a great conversation. So go look it up in Four Corners' YouTube.
Yeah. So I asked him about this kind of, I can't remember if it was on or off air initially, but the sense of space is huge. The depth of time that the series covers, and okay, that sounds like it takes place over 200,000 years. It doesn't. It does take place within this kind of 10-year window for the most part, but everything that has gone on in the preceding dozens and dozens and dozens of millennia bleeds into the present. So the analogy I think I used with Erickson, or maybe he used it, I'll claim it to sound more smart, is looking up at the stars. And when you look up at the stars and you feel this vastness, and everyone, I think, has this memory of looking out at the ocean or looking up at the stars or looking out at a landscape and feeling that sense of almost claustrophobia because everything around you is so big. I really encountered that for the first time with Malazan. I think it's much more common in sci-fi. Stuff like Ian M. Banks handles this really well, the sense of space. But Malazan, I would say, is the quintessential fantasy version of that world building that is very much tied into scale.
I think one of the things that for me made Malazan, I don't know exactly how you pronounce it, but anyway,
however you
made it, what made it really unique for me was how much high fantasy it is, while at the same time being really grounded in societal anthropological concepts. To me, that is what makes Malazan so unique. It's got this incredible high fantasy world. I mean, there are some spoilers, but there are giant jade statues that hit the world. It's got a magic system that has warrens. It has people that are 15,000 years old. It's extremely high fantasy, like absurdly ungrounded in our physics in terms of its reality. But it is so well grounded in how a society would react. It is so well grounded in how people would develop civilizations and so on. It's incredible to read from that perspective. And I don't know if that stood out to you when you were reading it.
Yes. So I think just kind of playing off that one thing. I mean, the Malazan, the word Malazan comes from the empire that is like at the heart of the series, right? The Malazan Empire. When you jump into book one, it's all about this empire that is trying to expand and conquer, kind of for its own sake. I don't think it's really kind of given much of an explanation at the beginning about why it's trying to get bigger. Empires just generally try to do that. And the way the empire is handled in Malazan, and I think you'll have a lot more kind of knowledge and real world historical context to draw on here. It feels very, very realistic. It doesn't just feel like an indictment of the process of empire. Often in the series, although often it's very violent and bloody, there's also the sense at which, okay, but the people inside the empire are actually living arguably a better life. You know what I mean? The roads are paved and the foodstuffs are coming down and to be traded off. And there's a sense in which it's a real world complicated representation. It's not just this side bad, this side good. It feels much more resonant with what has happened with historical periods going back.
Indeed, it's very hard to pin down a bad guy in Malazan, right? I mean, if I think of like my favorite characters, some of them have opposed each other over the course of the series, and they are still Fantastic. Like, I have a particular love for the bone hunters, but I also enjoy the bridge burners, and those two have not gotten along throughout the series. There have been,
Yes.
there have been disagreements. So
Yes.
if you were to speak of like your favorite characters in Malazan, like what to you made the most impact?
That's a great question. Oh, I like that. So there's a few different characters who tend to be kind of favorites, right, of the series. Right, Anamander Rake is this big, majestic, huge presence who is hundreds of thousands of years old and carries that burden of history with him, and he's often a fan favorite. There's often Tehol and Bug, who are this kind of comedic duo who prance almost comedically like a Shakespeare play around the stage, and just have lots of fun. There's a character called Krupp or Kruppa, opinions vary on that pronunciation, who is almost like the person who Erikson is sort of narrating through a lot of the time, almost like a Falstaffian figure from Shakespeare. Do you know, for me, and I would actually link this back to Song of Ice and Fire, I think I sometimes take a broader perspective on character and what character means. Because it's interesting, you mentioned the bridge burners and the bone hunters, who are two, if you're not aware, kind of companies or armies that that occur and rise up and fall within the series. I kind of tend to view these armies as characters themselves. Erikson gets the complaint sometimes, and I think it's erroneous, but he sometimes gets the complaint that his characters are too thin and they don't spend enough time on the page. But I think that the truth is that I disagree with that fundamentally on a character by character level, but I think also you need to see stuff like armies as a character in and of themselves, because if you think of it in that way, you have this group of people who are moving in the same way like Lord of the Rings towards a certain destination, towards a certain end goal. And it's almost like the army, when they are moving towards whatever battle or sequence or whatever they're doing, the interactions between the soldiers on the ground there, it's very resonant with like an internal monologue that a character might have with themselves as they walk along to a more traditional sort of fantasy quest. And that kind of bickering and doubting and long dark nights of the soul, that all happens, but it happens on this larger scale of companies and regiments. Yeah. What about you? Who's your favorite character?
So my favorite character is probably the commander of the 14th, as at least that's what she is when we meet her, which is Devor Paran. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway, I really liked her because I have, and through her, I love the bone hunters. I have a particular soft spot for characters that are bound by their honor to a cause that is not necessarily just. To me, that kind of tragic figure is very appealing for whatever reason. So I really enjoyed her. I really enjoyed Quick Ben as well. And of course, Anamander Rake is, he does loom over the whole series in a very real way. So, I would,
So I was going to say, it's interesting hearing you talk about, characters with conflicted loyalty, having read your book in the last couple of months, because that's definitely there as well, isn't it? But yeah, I think it's really good. It's a fruitful place to do that in terms of army and military and rank. To what extent do you follow orders, and to what extent do you do your own thing, and to what extent should armies themselves follow orders? Is a big question in Malazan. Yeah, I totally agree with what you said.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that about the Bone Hunter story. It did unpack that question where, like, the concept of an army is based on loyalty. It's based on hierarchy. It cannot function without these things. And yet there comes a point where you ask yourself, are we the baddies? And how you answer that is key to what you do next.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yes. I did appreciate that extremely much as a thematic component. Yes. Now, there are people who do quit Malazan, and they generally quit Malazan at Deadhouse Gate. Yeah. So if they get through, if they get through Gardens of the Moon,
yes,
and Gardens of the Moon can be a difficult read. They generally quit the Deadhouse Gate because of the non-linear storytelling.
Yes,
because they're like, who are these people that we've never met or heard of before? Why are we suddenly with them? What is going on here? And so how did you find the nonlinear storytelling, and why did it not throw you out? I guess is the question.
Yes. I would dispute what you said. You know, I would be interested if anyone's read it who would chime in later on about if they quit Malazan. I mean, I don't know what you're doing 15 minutes into a Malazan conversation if you quit it, but I've always found that people kind of bounce off in gardens. Like they'll get 300, 400 pages into gardens, and that's where they'll kind of back out as they very quickly realize it's not for them. My mum did that. She bounced off gardens gloriously. You know, she said for years, because she knows I adore it to pieces. And so I said to her, like, you've got to read this. And she read, again, Song of Ice and Fire in about 2 weeks. And she's read other stuff that I've thrown at her. But something about Malazan just didn't click with her. And I think it was that she felt like it was maybe a bit too thin, a bit too spread out. That you weren't, you know, hanging out with one person. But I would say that non-linear structure is not just from book to book. I think the non-linear structure is basically there from the jump. Because if you look at, I mean, maybe a bit of spoilers here, but the first kind of third of Gardens of the Moon jumps all over the place. Like you start, where do you start with Gardens? You start with the flashback sequence in Moxhold. You then move to the Fisher Girl getting basically abducted magically. You then move to Ganawa's Paran in the same scene. And then you move back to the battle sequence on Pale, and then you have a flashback within the battle sequence on Pale, and then you flash forward, and then you go back, and like that, it's all over the place. Yeah. So I think people find very quickly whether or not they can kind of, I don't want to say keep up, that's a bit patronizing, but whether it's for them within those first 100 or 200 pages. And I think that book by book disjunct is not quite as difficult as I think a lot of people make it out to be, because it's actually baked into the text from the jump. And then, of course, you get to stuff like Book 5 in Malazan, and it's already a completely new story again. But I guess my hot take with kind of the difficulty of Malazan that people find is, and I don't know if this is really going to deter people, but I actually don't think books 1 through 5 are that challenging a read. I think books 6 through 10 are a substantially more challenging read than books 1 through 5. So people talk about just get through books 1 and 2 and you'll be okay. And I actually think the greater cognitive legwork, if I can call it that, again, that sounds a bit smug, comes from book 6 through 10 as all these pieces are getting tied up and kind of thematically resolved. I don't know if that was your experience or not.
I almost bounced out at book 8. I almost bounced out at book 8.
My favorite book of all.
Yeah, the end of book 7, I was like, I'm not sure if I have it in me to read the last 3, but I did, and I'm glad I did. It was a very satisfying read.
Yes,
but I did almost bounce out there. I will say that Deadhouse Gates was, if I had bounced out anywhere early, it would have been in Deadhouse Gates. Just because it was a completely different set of characters. And I was like, but I'm invested in these guys. Where are these guys? You know, because Deadhouse Gates, you suddenly switch to, I think it's Deadhouse Gates where you suddenly switch to Krupp.
Deadhouse Gates, no, you keep Fiddler and you keep Crocus and you keep, I'll call her, I don't know what to call her because her name changes, so I'll leave her to the side for now. And you keep Kalam. And then everyone else is a new cast on a new continent, a continent that you barely even heard of. And I can understand why that would throw people off. But I think the thing is, Deadhouse Gates is such a marvelous book, especially the ending of Deadhouse Gates, that once you get to the end of Deadhouse Gates, I think you are kept till the end, for most people at least. Yeah.
No, I agree. Like if you make it through Gardens of the Moon and Deadhouse Gates, then I think you finish the series for the most part. And if you get the end of book 7 is a bit it's a bit touchy, or it was for me anyway. So
what was it? Can I interrupt you? What was it about book 7 that threw you off that late in the game?
I didn't like what was going on with Anamanda Rake in book 7.
You mean book 8, Anamanda Rake? Toll the Hound.
Yes, sorry, book 8. It was book 8. Yeah, Toll. Yeah. Book 8. It was book 8, and that was where I almost bounced off. I didn't like that. Like I was like, no, you can't hurt him, which is ridiculous. Are we
okay with spoilers?
Been massively hurt.
Yeah. Are we okay with spoilers here? Yeah, Marie.
I think so. I think we're okay with spoilers.
There's kind of I don't know, a Jesus-y element to Anamanda Rake at the end, isn't there? It's a very poignant, very heavy scene. And it's a very sacrificial scene, but he really it is the ultimate, I think, sacrifice in all of the books in a lot of ways is what happened to Anomander Rake. I love those last 300 pages. I'd have the complete polar opposite of you. For me, Toll the Hounds was my favorite book. Possibly just in fiction in general. I think the weightiness and the ponderousness of it is the Marmite factor for a lot of people. Erikson, I think, lost his father or was losing his father when he wrote it. And that often kind of generates, it seems, with his prose a lot more kind of substantial philosophizing, navel gazing. I don't know what you'd want to call it. Someone said to me in the last week that one reason Toll the Hounds threw them off, and this was quite interesting. She said that it was quite it felt like a very duty book, a book intended for men, which I thought was quite an interesting perspective. The idea that it's taking a lot of these topics from a quite masculine perspective, and that gave her not pause, but kind of the feeling that maybe it wasn't intended for her as much as the other books were.
I didn't find that. So I'll tell you what, I love Toll the Hounds. Don't get me wrong. But when I reached the end of Toll the Hounds, I was like, I'm not sure I want to read the next two without him. Like it was that kind of feeling. Like, and I guess to me, it was almost like the series should now end. This thing has happened. I should now be allowed to sit with these books and, absorb this and grieve and so on. And I mean, as I say, I'm glad I did finish it. But that was that for me was a moment.
I think what Book 8 does very well, it is half an ending. I think I'd say that a lot of the ending of Malazan happens in Book 8, and the other half happens in Book 10. So I totally understand why you'd want to take a pause. And it's interesting, if you ever look at booktubers who are reading Malazan, a lot of them will take a substantial pause at the end of Book 8. It just seems to be a pattern that they get to the end of Book 8 and they need some room. But tell you what, now that we're at the end of the series, another thing that I really love about Malazan, and I don't think you'll disagree with me about this, I think one thing that Malazan does excellently in terms of world building is that idea of the world carrying itself forward. I think often authors will create their world before they start to write, which is, you probably should. But the issue that often happens there is the world feels very static. It almost feels like a video game where the environment isn't very destructible, and the characters are just sort of walking through this thing that has been predetermined and preset. And one thing that I just adore about Malazan is the world keeps going, and sometimes that's because of the plot, and sometimes that's just because the world is constantly developing, just like our world constantly is. We're not in the same world that we were in 20 years ago, and I think Malazan is a really, really resounding case of this. So to give one example, if we're into spoilers. I'm just seeing this now. Yeah, book 9 and 10 are often viewed as one book. I've said to Erikson, I disagree. I think book 9 is its own book. But that's generally how people tend to see it. Book 9, by the way, also just a absolutely new cast of characters. Out of nowhere, we get suddenly like 2 new plot lines. But yeah, for Coral, the city of Coral in Malazan, I think is a really strong example of that world just continuing and moving on, where you have this city, it gets put through the absolute ringer. You get to book 8. And it's a completely different set of circumstances because what has preceded it. And then you get to, and you don't really see it much after that, but you also get the understanding based on what happens in book 8 that this city is going to continue and develop and change, and that nothing is static in this world, which is a trap I feel like a lot of fantasy writers can fall into because they're so loath to start breaking apart the toys that they have made. I don't know if you'd agree with that or.
I do. So I would like to, Don't hate me too much, but that is a trap that Brandon Sanderson very often falls into. So Brandon Sanderson builds a really solid plot, and he builds some really fantastic magic systems. I've referenced him as a world builder. He is really good at it. I'm not knocking the guy. But because he is a very plot-driven writer, right? So he famously plots his work, everything is very much geared towards an end goal. His worlds can feel very linear and focused towards the plot. Yes. They do not have a sense of vastness. Even Stormlight Archive is not vast, and that is his biggest world.
Yes, it does feel quite small, doesn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that is just, it's a function of the way that he writes. He doesn't write a story in a world. He writes the story of the world.
Yes.
And then that's done. Right? The exception to that has been the actual core Mistborn world, where he's written a second age. But even that second age is a little limited. Like, it's an immediate industrial age. Yes. The world goes from feudal to industrial without even taking the time to stop and smell the Enlightenment roses.
Yes. I think he often does have these substantial changes, but I think the substantial world building changes happen at the climax of the series. It never happens in the middle. It's always at the back end that sets the things in motion for the next step of the journey. And then I think you're right, there is a jump there where we don't see that progress. It just sort of happens, and then we're expected to move on. Yeah.
And it's very rarely, again, don't knock me, but it's very rarely deep cultural matters. Like, he builds really great fantasy elements. Okay, really innovative fantasy elements. His magic is great. The whole Stormlight surges is great. The whole some of his cultural stuff is great. Like the safe hand in Stormlight is fantastic.
Yeah.
But he very rarely does cultural advancements. He very rarely does real kind of anthropological stretch of a culture over time and what that history would mean. And I mean, there's like Erickson, as far as I know, is an anthropologist, right? So he has a massive advantage over, everybody else, basically. And I mean, I get that. And I mean, George R.R. Martin, who also does it, but George R.R. Martin cheats. Cheats.
How does he cheat?
Okay. You're Scottish, yeah?
Yep.
You ever heard of War of the Roses?
Yeah. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. The historical influence is what one knows. Yeah.
A Song of Ice and Fire is zombies meets War of the Roses.
Yeah.
That's what it is, right?
Which is a great premise, to be fair.
Yeah. It's an amazing premise. Okay. And he has really adapted history well. And I have referenced that in multiple videos on how to use history to build a culture, to build a world. He is phenomenal at it. And I love his books. Do not get me wrong, right?
Yes.
But he absolutely lifts straight out of history.
Yes.
Right. The Plantagenets are an almost 1-for-1 match for the Targaryens. The whole concept of the Valerians themselves is kind of Romanesque.
Yes.
The freehold is kind of Romanesque. The Dothraki are extremely Golden Horde or Kubla Khan style of
yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I am not throwing stones. I do it myself, but he does do it very, very clearly.
Yeah.
Like
I don't mind a bit of stone throwing, by the way. I quite enjoy the stone throwing. So
yeah.
don't stop it on my account. I think you said that really, I think this was a fundamental sea change in how I saw fantasy. And this isn't really a Malazan point. This is a more general point. Is I think a lot of people misinterpret what world building means. And specifically, I'm thinking about how world building is constructed and where your first thought goes. Because at least for me, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, my first thought when you say the word world building is map. I think you open up the book, and this is kind of enforced by publishing and things like that, is that you open up a book, George R.R. Martin, whatever. I think the new Malazan Broken Binding has it too. You open up the cover, and what do you see? You see that gorgeous map. And I think that's such a mistake, because that leads us to believe that the more granular the map is, the better the world building is. And yeah, and it's totally farcical, right? Because shall I throw some stones? Do you know what? Mistborn Era 2 is a good example of this, because Mistborn Era 2, book 4, I actually really enjoy Mistborn Era 2. I think it's one of the best things Sanderson has written. But in book 4, you have this massive map. It's an absolute tapestry of everything. And he really kind of shows us what Scadrial is like. And so you look at that and you go, this is going to be the best example of world building ever. And as we've already said, Mistborn Era 2 is probably one of the better examples. But then you've got a map like Farseer. And I know we both very much enjoy Robin Hobb. You look at the Realm of the Elderlings map, and it is a terrible map, man. Like, you open it up, it looks like it's about 10 miles by 10 miles. It's got a couple of mountains. It's got like 6 cities on it. So if you were to look at that map, you would just go, okay, she's not really done her homework here, has she? But the truth is, what Robin Hobb has done is she creates her world building based on culture and character. So if I were to keep running away with the example of Robin Hobb, who I've been praising endlessly on my channel, I'm only up to a Tawny Man. And I hear that it falls apart a little bit in Rainwild, so we'll find out. But be that as it may, what Robin Hobb does so brilliantly is...
I really enjoyed Rainwilds. So just to give you a contrary example, I loved Rainwilds. I have no problem with Rainwilds whatsoever. I would not read the Soldier Sun series. That series was trash.
Yes, trash.
With the best love to Robin Hobb, who is one of my favorite authors, whom I have read to bits and pieces.
Yes.
Soldier Sun was trash.
So what I was going to say about Robin Hobb, though, is her world building is predicated on character and culture, right? Where you have let's take Fitz. Fitz is the example. Yeah. Fitz is very much a product of who he is and where he grows up, which is basically in the stable of a castle for his young adult life. So that informs who he is. But then you zoom out a bit and he's still living in a castle, which informs who he is. And then you zoom out a bit further and he's not just living in a castle, he's living on the castle on the top of a hill in the capital city of a United States of Nations, of smaller nations, that is the 6 duchies. So there is some autonomy and power there. But then you zoom out even further and you realize that the 6 duchies is actually seen by the wider world as quite barbaric and a little bit backwards compared to other parts of the world. And so a lot of who Fitz is and a lot of who the surrounding characters are is a direct consequence of the cultures and the world that has been created by Hobb. And that kind of world building strikes me as so much deeper than just a map on page 1. And I think that's what I was missing a few years ago, and something that I've kind of had to bring to my own attention.
So for me, like I love a good map, don't get me wrong, but a map to me is not where you start. And like, if you really take this back to like Tolkien, who, you know, arguably is the grandfather of the genre, he started with a language because it was what he loved. Right? He was a linguist and he made up a language, and then he made up a whole series of other languages, and he made the whole world in order to justify his languages.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah. I mean, it shines in his love for both languages and the world. So he understood that languages change over time, and therefore he needs to invest all this time in how the world works and why it would develop these languages. And that's why, like, enduringly, Lord of the Rings is incredibly rich. I know you haven't read the books. Have you seen the movies?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have at least an idea of how it works.
Yes.
But yeah, so his world building is incredibly detailed and rich, based around those languages and his approach, and that of course informs culture and all the rest of that kind of thing. And in some ways, like, I think that there are some authors who build fantasy first. Right? They build the fantastical elements first. And like, I am a big fan of fantasy elements. I love me some high fantasy, right? Yeah. But the problem with building fantasy first is if you don't then spend the time to embed it on the cultural level, everything else feels thin.
Yes.
You've got a great magic world, and there's not that much cultural weight to your cultures, your countries, your worlds, your structures, any of that. And it just, yeah. And that I feel is what Malazan really did phenomenally well. Probably like on a par with Tolkien-esque style of world building. There's Malazan built high fantasy and really embedded it in the culture.
Yes.
That Erickson really went all the way down to the bedrock of the cultures and embedded both the fantasy and the world. And his characters are a natural outgrowth of the cultures, which I feel sometimes authors get too much into like special snowflake syndrome, where where they have this culture and the character is the complete opposite and is rebelling against their culture.
Yes. I mean, I just read the first Sun Eater book and I thought it was generally successful, but the first Sun Eater book is absolutely guilty of that. It's just the character railing against the circumstances he's in. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's like that I feel is really one of the distinguishing features for me with Malazan. Is that element of it. And then like there are things that I really love about Malazan. I love Otataral as like a concept, the magic eating
yes.
ore.
Yes. The one that always I think is really devastating and wonderful in terms of magic and culture and species. I mean, in Malazan, it's not really about the cultures of the peoples, although that exists. It's much more about the cultures between the different races. And one thing that I think that, and I'm sure you'll agree with me on this, that is handled just beautifully, but also devastatingly in Malazan is the case of the Talanai Mas. This race of people who are being, it seems as though at the beginning, very much subjugated by a different race called the Jaghut. And so what the Talanai Mas, or the Imas, they're called, they're basically kind of framed as kind of, Homo sapien, not Homo sapien sapien, like, us, but maybe a couple 100,000 years previous. What they do to escape the subjugation by another race and other people is they do this thing called the ritual. I think it's just called the ritual. Forgive me if I'm wrong there. I could be misremembering. But basically what the ritual is they zombify themselves. They refuse to die individually or as a people until all the Jaghut are wiped off the face of the earth. And this sounds, I mean, I'm framing it negatively, but in some ways you could kind of view it as noble. Like we will fight them until we come through. And you could kind of see a case for like a kind of heroic bravery there. But one thing that the series does magnificently is show how misinformed and tragic this is, because obviously not every Jaghut is terrible. And also, as we've just talked about, time moves on. And you have the case now, as at the start of the series, and this isn't really a spoiler beyond the first half of book one, you have, although I think spoilers are kind of moot at this point, but you have this people who have encased themselves in their need for revenge to the point where you now have some speckles of Jaghut still living on this world and on the worlds that need to be eradicated for them to find peace. But the Jaghut at this point are just people. They're just people. And so what you kind of realize over the course of Gardens, but kind of broadly as the whole series, is these people have utterly doomed themselves by their circumstances that they found themselves in, which were initially no fault of their own, but their reactions to those circumstances have such long-reaching consequences. So when you were talking about, culture and magic intertwined to create the world building, the Talanai Mas were the first thing I went to immediately.
Yeah. And I want to come back to the Talanai Mas, but first I just want to address a comment here. The geocultural feel or flow of the world as it's built lends itself to a rough map, at least, especially if you're going to journey in the world or interact with more than one culture. So often, yes. And I mean, I have maps myself, but it doesn't have to be a spectacular map. Yes. It can be any map that gives the reader enough information. Like a beautiful map is beautiful, and I'm not denying it, right? But I interviewed Jacqueline Carey not long ago, and we were talking about her map. She writes historical fantasy, okay? So it's set in historical Europe, but with fantasy elements. They're gorgeous. Okay. I highly recommend them, read them, but regardless. So she was telling me that, so I said to her, your map doesn't have my country on it, but you're in Europe. Because your map doesn't have Finland on it at all. It just stops at Germany, and, and she said, well, yes, but that's because I gave the publisher just a quick hand-drawn map of how the journey goes, and they didn't get anybody else to do it. They just took my map. And I was like, okay. But it worked. It worked for its purpose, and the hand-drawn map really gave it a sense of authenticity because it's written in first person.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like a great map is great, right? There's nothing wrong with it. But you don't have to spend all of your time world building locations and maps. It is more important that the reader understands kind of the world and the cultures than that they have a very clear, detailed map, in my opinion.
Yes, and I think the other thing as well, whenever I see, I don't know if you do this, but whenever I see a map, my first thought is, I wonder what's past the map. And I have a real soft spot for books that go beyond the map. So Song of Ice and Fire, the first thing I always see is the land of always winter. I'm always very curious about what that looks like. And then we saw it in the TV show and it wasn't very interesting. And then another one, a really fabulous example is the Narnia books, right? Voyage of the Dawn Treader is, in my opinion, the hands down the best Narnia book. I'm actually very soft on the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I think is basically copy paste Christianity, which is fine. But C.S. Lewis is like, no, it's not. He really hated that criticism, and it's so blaringly obvious. But the reason I like Voyage of the Dawn Treader is that the characters go off the map on their boats, and I find that just really, really exciting. And I think it shows that we like to kind of take a look at the map at the beginning, but the curiosity of the reader is always what is on the other side.
Yeah.
And so I think that often maps are drawn, but then kind of set limits in a way we don't necessarily want on our stories.
See, this is a thing. Like, I don't know if you've ever played role-playing games.
Minimally.
Like D&D stuff. Okay, so I have played role-playing games since I was 20, since I went to university. And I've mostly been a GM for most of my life. And this is a lesson that I learned about players. If you give a player a city, they'll want to go outside the city and see what's in the countryside. If your map includes the countryside, they'll be like, okay, but what's over the border in the next barony? And then if they can go there, they'll be like, okay, but what's over there? Like, players always want to break the map, always, without fail. And I think readers are much the same. They're like, what is beyond the borders?
Yes.
So, yeah. So no, I agree. The one thing, like your topic of the Talamas brought up with me. Have you read Stormlight Archive?
Yes. And you know what? I'm going to throw stones, Marie. I'm going to do it.
Do you sometimes feel that there was some, like, I will never accuse Brandon Sanderson of plagiarism, and I'm not doing it now. But I do feel that he was heavily inspired by Malazan.
Do you know, I think he has said he's read it. I mean, they're very different authors. Yeah, you're talking about the heralds and things like that, right? Would that be?
The Parsendi.
Yes,
the Parsendi who are oppressed and who go into a state of not being, their actual shapes, who just go into dull form in order to survive the oppression. And Bridge Crew 4 versus the Bridge Burners.
Yes.
And the heralds. And there's elements.
It's interesting. And, I've never really considered a comparison between Sanderson and Erickson. I actually think, Erickson has famously said that he doesn't write grimdark, right? And he gets really annoyed when people say that he writes grimdark fantasy, because although his stuff gets pretty bleak, and I would say book 9 in particular, Dust of Dreams, does flirt with nihilism and existentialism and things like that. It's a really kind of meditation on purpose. Whenever he does that kind of stuff, in my opinion at least, he always comes out of it positively, or at least bittersweet. And I think that's why Erickson hates this idea of him being grimdark, because compared to Abercrombie, who always ends in the most comically dark way possible, and compared to, I'm reading R. Scott Baker right now. I don't know if you've read Baker, but he goes places. Yeah. But I actually think there maybe is a comparison there to be made with Sanderson, in that they both do see the light at the end of the tunnel. And maybe that light isn't pure, glorious, happy ending light, but it's always there.
Yeah. So I would say, like, for me, this is the difference between dark fantasy and grimdark fantasy, right? So dark fantasy is like the series Castlevania. It's dark. terrible things happen to the characters. There's terrible sacrifices to be made. The plot takes you to a horrifying place. But the end is uplifting. At
Yes.
the end of it, you're like, yes, this was horrifying to fight through, but I reached the end and I feel like a better person.
And there's catharsis. Yeah, there's always catharsis. Yes.
Grimdark is terrible things happen to the characters, and then it gets worse, and then the book ends.
Or even worse, what sometimes Joe Abercrombie does this till the cows come home. The characters seem like they're going to get better, and then he just wrenches it away. Yeah, there's a glimmer of hope, and it just gets snuffed. Yeah.
I do not like Grimdark. I appreciate Abercrombie for a lot of things, but I do not like Grimdark, and so I don't, generally speaking, read it.
Yes,
I want that. I want to get to the end of the book and feel like there's hope. If I wanted to feel like there wasn't hope, I'd read history.
That's the most brutal line you could say. That's a very bleak line, isn't it? Yeah. It's true. You know, one thing I want to get more into is historical fiction. I've been speaking to friends who've been reading historical fictions, Bernard Cornwell and Ken Follett, and it's just not an area I'm very well read in at all. But I feel like it would absolutely, I know we're kind of spinning outside of Malazan now, but I feel like it would absolutely be my wheelhouse. It's just something I've never really invested much time or thought into.
I really enjoyed, in historical fiction, I really enjoyed Ken Follett.
Yes.
Pillars
of the Earth.
Pillars of the Earth, that's the one. It's about building a cathedral in England. So good. Somebody here says Cromwell's Sharp War. So that's also a good option. I also really enjoyed James Clavell's books. Shogun, very good. Yeah. Brutal, but good. And then if you like historical fantasy, I seriously do recommend Jacqueline Carey. I recommend her to everyone.
Jacqueline Carey.
Yeah. So good. Also, you know, that'll allow you to talk about romantasy, because she's like OG romantasy, except she's also epic fantasy with great world building and political intrigue and so on. So highly recommend.
The word romantasy is such a strange one these days, isn't it? Because it carries so much baggage. In a way that's probably unfair and unwarranted.
So yes and no. The problem with romantasy is that it's like, I opened the top 10 of Amazon's epic fantasy list the other day, and the first 10 books were all romantasy books, right? Which, like, I have nothing against romantasy. Like I say, my favorite author in all the world is Jacqueline Carey. But if I'm looking for an epic fantasy book, I don't necessarily want the romantasy. I would like to, you know, see some epic fantasy books that don't focus on romance.
Yes.
As an option.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think who was it? There's a really famous YouTuber who made a video on it. Was it Twilight? Was it Lindsay Ellis? I don't know if Lindsay Ellis is kicking about. I know she took a hiatus, but she had a really good video some years ago about the Twilight books, and it was phenomenal. And it really did change my perspective on this. And it's interesting now that we're going through, I would say, a second wave, or maybe an adult wave of romantasy. Whereas, you know, Twilight is obviously aimed at young adults, but her premise, and maybe I'm paraphrasing this or butchering it, so forgive me if that's the case, but she basically said something along the lines of, why are we culturally so, and I'm not saying this is you, but why are we culturally so dismissive of romance leaning fantasy when we are not as dismissive of stuff that is aimed at more kind of masculine male audiences, but is equally as entertaining? It's primarily made for entertainment. Why are we so forgiving of A and not B? Is it just a misogynist thing? That's kind of what she was implying, but that's always stayed with me. I thought it was a really interesting case that we're far more forgiving of certain forms of light entertainment than others.
So, yes, to some extent, although I will tell you straight off the bat that if my epic fantasy top 50 book was, the first 10 books was like sword and sorcery action, I would also
Yes.
be disappointed, because
Yes.
when I go looking for epic fantasy, right, I'm looking for things like Malazan, things like Stormlight, things like A Game of Thrones. I'm looking for very big, rich worlds with characters, and that tells a long, involved story, right? That
Yes.
is the genre that I'm looking for in epic.
Yes.
And possibly with some save the world elements. It doesn't have to have it, but it's nice to have some existential threats, right?
Yes.
And I don't particularly want bubblegum fantasy of any description dominating the epic fantasy genre, whether it's bubblegum action or whether it's bubblegum romance, or that's kind of my feeling on it. Yeah. So I've got, as I say, I've got nothing. I will sometimes go and look for romantasy, and then I'll be like, I want romance and fantasy. Give it to me. Give it to me now. Or I'll go looking for bubblegum. I'll be like, I want a sword and sorcery book. Give it to me. And then I enjoy those books in that moment. So that to me is what a genre does. A genre helps you separate what you're feeling like right now, and it helps you find the right book. And that's kind of my problem with what's going with the romanticists right now, is they're kind of spreading into every element of
Yes.
yeah.
I mean, 10 years ago it was zombies, and 15 years ago before that something else. So
100%.
Yeah.
It does. It's very common. But yeah. So somebody said here, Flintlock fantasy. I don't know if you've read Gunpowder Mage.
I have not read a single page of Flintlock fantasy.
Uh-huh.
Isn't that awful?
You should read Gunpowder. And they said Cromwell's Sharp War, which absolutely is a great Flintlock fantasy. But I also really, really enjoyed the Gunpowder Mage trilogy, which is basically like a French Revolution type of thing with magic.
Shall I run you through some series I haven't read, and you can tell me which ones you think would be worth my while? Because I'm looking at the series I haven't cracked open yet, and I'm curious to see what your opinion are about them. So the big one that I haven't read is Lord of the Rings, which I know is egregious, and I will get to it at some point, but I need to basically take that one off. I've not read Lies of Loch Lamora, which I've heard is fabulous, but I've never quite felt like the need to pick it up. And the other one, okay, interesting. And the other one that comes to mind very quickly is the Dandelion Dynasty, that everyone kind of writes home about. And I've not read that either. So those are three just off the top of my head that I've not ever had the chance to crack open.
So I'll tell you what the problem with Lies of Loch Lamora is. The first book is great. The first book really is well done. The series falls off a cliff after that, in my opinion. So I enjoyed the first book. The books 2 and 3 just, for me, fell off a cliff.
And it's in that same kind of realm as Rothfuss and Martin, isn't it? With although I think he said that the fourth one's coming soon, but I mean you would say that, wouldn't you? So I guess there's a. Do you know what I do find myself slightly. I know this is a spicy take, I don't know, but I do find myself infuriated with authors who don't finish their work. Infuriated is the wrong word, because I know that there's often stuff like mental health difficulties and struggles going on behind the scenes. But I still find myself hesitant to invest time in something that has a big question mark hanging over it.
So Martin, I will still recommend, because A Song of Ice and Fire is spectacular in its own right, and you can make up some kind of ending for yourself for satisfaction's sake.
Okay.
Right? Like A Song of Ice and Fire really is, it's spectacular as a book series, as the whole journey of Ned and Ned's failure, and how it points out the systemic problems in a feudalist system, and why aristocracy is actually not a great form of government. All of those things are great.
Yes.
But Rothfuss, I will not recommend.
Okay.
Like, Name of the Wind was really good. The second book was not. The second book was Coffee goes to an island and becomes the sex the sixth god of sex god by nailing the sixth. It's
Oh,
it's just,
Felurian. That's her name, Felurian.
yes,
Oh,
it's just
yeah.
over, and it's absurd.
Yeah.
And then of course the third book. So he said he's going to release a chapter one or the prologue or something if he reached this charity goal on like a donation thing.
Yeah, I followed that a bit. Yeah.
And then he didn't. Like, and that to me, I was just like, no, my man. No. Like, I don't blame Martin. I figure Martin's at the point where it's really hard to finish that series because it's really big. And, he's let the diamond grow to like absurd lengths.
Yes.
And he's old and he's got a lot of money.
He's in his late 70s, isn't he?
Yeah. And he's got no impetus to finish.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He is rich. Like, he's got no need. He's got no drive to finish. Yeah. And I get that. I don't blame the man. But I really I have a bone to pick with Patrick Rothfuss about not finishing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then Matthew says, I dislike authors who do that and then constantly tease and blue ball the audience that it's coming soon, and then start banging on about other authors. Yes, I absolutely agree. And that's what I feel like Rothfuss has done. I mean, Martin doesn't do that. Martin has been explicitly like, my guys, when I'm finished, I will post it. Like, that's the best I can tell you.
He's not going to.
It's huge and it's difficult, and I'm struggling with it. Like, he hasn't been shy about it. And
I think the thing about Martin is that his plot. I mean, this is kind of what you're saying about the garden has grown too much. It's so organic what he's done. He's kind of just set some characters up and set the ball rolling, and now he has to basically take all these balls and try and cram them back in 2 books. But I think that's why he is so good. Is that, and just tying this back into world building, is that I often think that you hear the words bad world building, and I'm not even sure that bad world building exists too much. I think thin world building is far more common. But it's like, if you've ever done any kind of audiovisual stuff for like a concert or a service or anything, you only really notice it when it goes wrong. Let's say it's a church service or something, and someone's doing the PowerPoint slides at the back, and something goes wrong. And what's the first thing the congregation does? They'll turn around and stare pointedly at the man at the back to get it fixed. And I often feel like it's the same with world building, right? That we don't really notice it being bad unless it's extremely discordant. It's far more often than it's just forgettable.
Yeah. And I
think Martin is the opposite, where it feels so
unless
natural.
It throws you out of the story. You're not going to per se feel that it's bad. It's just not going to impact you.
Yes.
And that I guess, like, that was one of the things that I tried very hard to do, is to ensure that my world building is impactful where it needs to be.
Yes.
And I think, like, one of the biggest things I learned from Malazan, just to bring us back there, is that readers do not need a lot of detail in order to just read the book. Like, Malazan is thin on details. Right? When this thing starts, you're like, you know nothing, and everything is confusing.
Yeah.
And you're just reading because you're like, eventually I'll catch up. I'll catch up with this chaos eventually. Yeah. And eventually you do catch up with the chaos, and you understand the world and its richness. But it is hella confusing in the start. You're like, what is even going on here?
Yes. What's a warren? Where are the rabbits? Yeah.
Yeah. What's a warren? What is Ototaro? What? What is even going on here? That dude's 15,000 years old. How in the heck?
Why is this bird talking to me? Yeah.
Yeah. But it's crazy,
Yeah. But I think you're right. I think one thing from a reader's perspective that I find very interesting, and that I think must be super challenging for an author, is how much world building they put on the page, right? Because fundamentally, as authors, you are not writing, or most of the time, you're not writing a book called The World of Ice and Fire. You're telling a narrative inside a world. And I think from a reader's perspective, finding that balance between revealing the world and making that world cohere and making that world come out strongly on the page, while not just being an exposition dump and a slideshow of here are all the fun, cool countries that I've created for my world, must be an incredibly difficult challenge to do.
So I call it tour guide writing. When you go like, and if you look to your left, you will behold the culture of the blah, 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 that stand in opposition to the blah, blah, blah. And it's just a tour guide of the world. Yeah, it is a difficult balance to strike. And it is complex because you can confuse people and they can be thrown out. I think that what we have seen with a lot of from Malazan to Martin to Sanderson is that there's readers who will quite happily read Malazan and just run to catch up. And they're fine with being a little confused as long as it eventually clears up.
Yeah.
And then there's readers who want details, right?
Yes.
Stormlight Archive's prologue reads like a video game tutorial on how to use the magic system.
The Seth bit, right?
Yeah.
Press up to latch. Yeah.
Yeah. It's basically like, this is exactly how the magic system works. So, yeah. But for me, like, it's important that the reader has enough to understand what they need to in order to get what's going on in the scene. But more than that, I feel is something that can be revealed in time.
Yes.
It's just,
I mean, at the end of your first book, without, I don't know if you want to spoil us, but basically a whole new setting is sort of not unveiled because we knew it was there from the map. But, the last 15-20% of your book is moving to a new place and finding out one of the character's sort of origin settings. And I would agree with the decision you made there. There was no need to bring that up explicitly up until that point in the story, and actually withholding that does allow a greater sense of reward when it is finally revealed to you, and the kind of the motivations kind of undergirding this character. So I think it's a difficult line to walk, and I'm always in admiration of authors who decide to write in other worlds, because it's an extra challenge that you're really setting for yourself.
It was especially difficult for me because Louis is the POV character, and he's the only POV character in that book. He's the only character whose perspective you get, and I still have to somehow keep that relationship and origin story secret from the reader, without feeling like I'm keeping secrets, because you're in his head. So
Well, this is the other challenge of world building, isn't it? Is it's not really, we say world building, but the truth is it also depends on not just how you reveal that world, but the lens through which you reveal it. Like, are you, for example, portal fantasy? It's very easy to do it with a portal fantasy because, Edmund jumps through the wardrobe and suddenly he's there, and you can't just have it all explained to him. But that's not really where fantasy is mainly at these days. And so you always have to consider the lens through which your world is being revealed, whether that's the case of Malazan, and it's just a matter of Erickson dumping you in it and hoping you catch up, or kind of some middle ground between those two examples.
It is, it is finding the middle ground is a complicated thing, but character building is part of world building, and so is the point of view that you share with the world, and it's a critical part to me. And I think I agree with your take on it, that like the world should impact the reader, but not in a way where they are, I don't know, the world shouldn't be dumped on them, but it should impact them in terms of making them think about the world. The world should be a character in its own kind of right.
Yes.
And I think then, you really achieve a great setting.
Yes, I think the other thing that I would probably just add in there, is the other way that maybe bad world building can occur is when everything is just viewed through a singular lens, right? There's one tragic event 100 years ago that has determined the society as it is today. Like if you look at the world today, World War II happened, we're getting close to 80, 90 years ago. And obviously it fundamentally has impacted the world we live in. But we are not, as a world, solely the consequence of World War II. There's a million little narrative threads that have made the world and each culture the way it is today. Even a country that's I'm in Kuwait right now, and obviously Islam has a huge history here in Kuwait. But Kuwait is not just it's other stuff too. And I think that can be a failing sometimes that authors bring into being, is when they just have this world was created because of this, and it's too simplistic and reductive.
We're 80 years on from World War II, and this week Germany has permanently deployed troops across its border in Lithuania, right?
Yes.
Which 40 years ago would have been inconceivable for Lithuania to welcome permanent deployment of German troops in their border. Like, it would have been shocking to even suggest it.
Yes.
But we are well past it now. The world has changed. Germany is no longer, what it was in the Third Reich. Like, it's things change.
Yes.
Cultures change, people change, society changes. And like, I feel like fantasy authors so often get trapped in that. And political fantasy writers are the worst sinners in this regard. They will write a whole political fantasy, reach the end of it, and be like, and now we're just going to, I don't know, replace the bad king with a good king, and everything is right in the wrong. What?
Who has a better story?
Come on, that is not how any of this works,
Yes.
Where is the systemic change? Where is the arguing over anything?
Yes.
Yeah.
I know we were kind of talking about Abercrombie previously. I think Abercrombie is a really good example of change happening in his world, where his various standalones and books take place like 10, 20 years apart from each other. And that's just enough to see that slow creeping change. And it's what I also appreciate about Abercrombie's gradual creeping change in his books is it's not just a case of, that whatever happened in the previous book, like we talked about with Sanderson, now impacting this book. It's genuinely just history moving itself along. So you get halfway through the standalones and suddenly gunpowder is being used because gunpowder has been invented, and it's extremely dodgy, basically suicidal, the gunpowder. But it shows again that creeping element. So when you do have, between book 1 and book 9, a serious systemic and cultural change, it does feel earned and it does feel deserved.
I love that about Abercrombie. I really do. But I hate that grim darkness. Like, I just give me a little bit of happiness. Just somebody have a happy ending.
I think if you stop Abercrombie's books halfway through, that's when they're happy. So just put the book over there.
It stops here.
Yeah. Orso's having a great time. Let's just I would agree with you.
Yeah. But I love his world building. I love his characters. Like, there's a lot to love about Abercrombie, but man.
And you get the sense that the thing about Abercrombie, and now we're just really on a side tangent, and I will argue this. I don't think Abercrombie cares about his world very much. People keep saying, when is the next first law book coming? And I'm like, I don't think Abercrombie cares about the world he's created as much as you guys do. I think he uses that world as a vehicle to put his characters through the ringer. And I think his books are fabulous. I mean, I love them. I would probably put them in my top 10 somewhere. But I also think he has created this world that is very interesting. But I don't think he, as a writer, is as emotionally attached to that world as a lot of his fans are. I think he's very happy to go off and do something else.
Yeah. No, I'm pretty sure he is.
Yeah.
That he strikes me as that way. But no, I do. Like, I really do appreciate Abercrombie. But yeah. By the way, what you were talking about with Edmund is the anchor character. Like, when you send a character through a portal, it's an anchor character world building. Yes. And what that is when you have a character who knows nothing and they can ask questions. They can ask questions because they don't know. And that's why so many books feature farm boys or outsiders or whatever, because they then become a vehicle for world building.
Yes.
And yeah.
Edmund is kind of an interesting one because he meets the big bad guy.
Yes.
If anything, Edmund is a slightly interesting twist there because he gets his moral system upended at the very beginning because he happens to stumble across the witch ice queen. I forget her name. Do you know the best Narnia book is Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and then I would say The Magician's Nephew.
Yes.
Chronologically, book one I think is fabulous. I love that creation myth that happens in Narnia. Yeah.
So do I. I love the creation myth. I also I love book 7, but only because it's utterly crazy. It's bananas. And I don't know if you've ever read the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last book in the Bible, Revelations, is bananas crazy insane. Right?
Yes. 7 seals, 7 dragons.
Yeah, that whole thing. And that was the inspiration for book 7 of Narnia. And you can see it so clearly in how bananas it is.
Yeah. It's pretty like it's brutal in the same way Revelation is a pretty brutal wrapping up, as it were. You know, not everyone, you talk about happy endings, not everyone in the book of Revelation gets a happy ending. But it's very strange seeing that imprinted onto a children's story where I believe, and I could be getting this wrong, basically Aslan just they're in a line and he basically goes yes, no, yes, no, yes, yes, no, yes, no. And I think that, and I could be totally wrong here. Last time I read Narnia was like 2017. But I believe the animals who get rejected from Aslan's the new Narnia get basically dissolved, or like they kind of fade into nothingness. And listen, it is a good kids representation of that eschatological story. But at the same time, it's like a 10-year-old reading that, I'm not sure I'd be like. I'd have to have a long talk with my kids as they're reading it about what it kind of pretends and the implications there, for sure.
So what you have to remember about Revelations, and I mean a lot of the pieces of the Bible, is to some extent it's wish fulfillment. It's written by people who are persecuted, or written by authors who are in a persecuted state. And I mean, okay, look, if you believe that the Bible is inspired by God, I'm not going to pull the rug out from under you. That is 100% fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But from a scholarly point of view, they were persecuted people who are writing a wish fulfillment about, I hope this happens to the people who are beating me up.
Yeah.
Who are suppressing me, who are, oppressing me, who are subjugating my children, etc., etc.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think there's a wee bit of a lag there. I would totally agree with what you were saying. I think but to be honest, I think most Christians would agree with what you're saying, unless they're anti-intellectual. Like the Book of Daniel is basically we are in exile. You have the Psalms, like how long? The Book of Lamentations, right, is all about this. Basically just moaning. Moaning is a bad way of putting it because it is actually quite a bleak state. But yeah, and you know what I've got written in my notes here? It's interesting you bring this up. I've been thinking about this all day. I might make a video about it on my channel. Is that the video I want to make on my channel is the word biblical as it pertains to world building, because I think we use that word biblical as synonymous with vast. And I think that word biblical carries a lot more weight and a lot more connotative baggage to unpack. So I've been thinking about this all day, actually, the word biblical in fantasy and what does that mean? Because we usually just use it to mean big. But I've also been kind of sitting here thinking, actually, I think the Bible, I mean, again, truth claims veracity. I'm just talking about it as a text currently. I think the Bible is quite an interesting example of world building in itself, especially the Old Testament, because it's not driven by any central character. It goes back to that thing of we're talking about like the cultural change over decades and various characters and the development of that world. I think there's a really interesting kind of case to be made there, and the world building, if you get me, of the Bible.
Yeah. I went on a massive research bend when I was looking into religions and how they work and how they form and so on. And I discovered the most fascinating thing, the Pentateuch, the first like sets of books of the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Israel and Judea, speak under correction, okay, I'm not a biblical scholar, but Israel and Judea were basically two tribes that were competing, right? And within the Jewish culture. Yes. And I think it was Judea who wrote down their history. Like they claimed authority by writing down their myths, their history, their ideology, etc., in these books. And because they wrote it down, they effectively won over the long term. Like who actually won between them, who actually dominated at the time when they, were both at the same time, it's unknown. But because the surviving text was written by Judea, that's the one that won.
Yeah.
Writing, man. Writing changes everything.
Yeah. And now we're really far afield, but I was telling a friend, one of my favorite rooms in the world is, I forget what it's actually called. It's the British Library in London. I don't know if you've ever been to London. Yeah, but they have the British Library has a room of treasures and manuscripts. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
All right, if you ever go to London or your next trip to London, British Library, it's free. You just walk in, and one of the first rooms you'll see when you walk in, I think it's just called the Room of Treasures. And it basically contains a wealth of biblical, musical, and literary and just kind of political documentation, original stuff. So you have, and the reason that this is now springing to mind is you have a text there called Codex Sinaiticus, which is I think the oldest complete copy of the Bible that we have, or the New Testament. And it was just in someone's cupboard in Egypt somewhere. And the scholar found it, like, can I take this? And they were like, sure. And he was like, okay. But inside that same room, you've got the Magna Carta, you've got the First Folio, you've got Jane Austen's writing desk, you've got the Beatles sheet music, you've got, oh my goodness, what's the name of that really, really famous Christian hymn? Handel's Messiah, I think it was Messiah, the sheet music, and all these things are just stacked next to each other in this really dimly lit room to preserve the paper. And this is just where my mind was going, hearing you talk about the Bible being written down. It's such a breathtaking little room, and heaven forbid something happens to that room, because it is genuinely astounding to walk through so much recent and ancient history all in one collection. Codex Sinaiticus is really interesting because obviously you had these scribes who were copying the text, and obviously trying to preserve it as best they possibly could. So what you have in the margins of Codex Sinaiticus is other scholars, having had this book passed on to them, writing stuff like, no, you got that word wrong. Don't change the text. This is what it originally said. And you're having this conversation between these scribes in this very ancient text. It's fascinating. I love talking about this.
It's amazing. Like I love the actual history of writing. It's so incredible. It's like the clay tablets that come down to us from like the Bronze Age kingdoms. It's incredible to me. Like, I love it. Yeah,
it's glorious. I want to do more of a deep dive into like ancient fantasy. I don't know if fantasy is the best word for it, but stuff like Gilgamesh. I read Gilgamesh, but all these ancient mythological tales is something that I'm speaking to Philip Chase as one example. It's like I really want to do more of that kind of medieval and ancient storytelling, because the ones I have read have all shone to me. Like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I think is a fabulous story. Beowulf, I think, is a wonderful story. Gilgamesh is a wonderful story. And I know that there's probably about 50 other ancient stories there that would be similarly interesting to go down that rabbit hole. When my children are teenagers and scream, I hate you, and close their door and slam it on me, that's when I'll get my ancient texts out.
I think one of the things that people must remember about the stories that have survived to us is that they are very much a survivorship bias, right? So people are very tempted to look back at the past and be like, the movies in the 80s were better. The movies in the 70s were better. The stories coming from the 19th centuries were better. The stories that have survived to reach us are the ones that were good enough to survive.
Yes.
Everything else withered on the vine.
Yes.
Everyone
talks about video games. Everyone talks about how good the PlayStation 2 era was. I'm like, do you not remember the amount of absolute shovelware? Like 99% of PlayStation 2 games were hot garbage. And we all just are collectively remembering this console as the golden age. Yeah,
I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and I remember the movies being trash. The few that have survived to now to be talked about, yes, they're spectacular, but there were, new movies every week, and most of them were hot garbage.
Yeah. Do you know, just going on this conversation, I remember very clearly one of the lectures I had. This was my second year at uni, and we were doing Renaissance literature. And so we were doing sonnets. We were doing Shakespeare's sonnets, Sir Philip Sidney, John Donne, all these amazing writers of sonnets. And she said exactly at this lecture, I forget her name, I don't even remember her face, but I remember her very clearly walking into this lecture hall and going, listen, you've read all these beautiful things where the writers have she said, I remember this line very clearly, had ink up to their elbows crafting these amazing sonnets. She's like, let me read you the average sonnet from the time. And she did exactly what you were saying, where she just took one of these sonnets that no one's heard of, that hasn't stood the test of time. And she went, I just need you to understand, this was still the standard back then. And these people, we talk about the Renaissance man, these people weren't superhuman. The golden stuff has trickled down. So exactly what you were saying.
Yeah. We remember Shakespeare. How many people remember even Richard Marlowe, who was, a competitor to him?
I love Marlowe, though. I think Dr. Faustus is just... Yeah.
I love
the end
Marlowe,
of Faustus, that sense of doom is incredible.
But we're in the minority,
Yes.
But so I mean, Anyway, so this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you to everybody who participated in the comments. Socrates' bastard son has left some great comments there about history. And I hope that everybody has enjoyed this very long conversation about Malazan and all the rabbits we chased.
Yes, all the Warrens.
And we will catch you again soon. Go subscribe to Four Corners of the Page.
Thank you.